The year is 1519. Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés stands at the edge of a vast lake, staring at something that seems impossible. Rising from the water like a dream made real is Tenochtitlan, a city more magnificent than anything in Europe. Gleaming white pyramids pierce the sky. Causeways stretch across the water like stone ribbons. Gardens float on the lake's surface. And at the heart of it all, the great temple rises 150 feet into the air, its twin shrines painted in brilliant red and blue. But Cortés doesn't know what we know. He doesn't know that this empire, which seems eternal, will be gone in just 2 years. He doesn't know that the very systems that made the Aztecs powerful will become the instruments of their destruction. And he certainly doesn't know the shocking truth about what really happened here, a truth far more complex than the simple story of conquest we've been told. This is the story of the Aztec Empire, not the sanitized version, not the demonized version, the real version, and it's going to challenge everything you think you know. Every empire has an origin story, but the Aztec story is different. Unlike Rome or Egypt, the Aztecs didn't start as a dominant civilization. They were refugees, outcasts, the people nobody wanted. Around 1100 CE, a group calling themselves the Mexica began migrating south from somewhere in northern Mexico. According to their own histories, they came from a mythical homeland called Aztlan, which is why we call them Aztecs today, though they never used that name for themselves. They were the Mexica, and they were searching for a sign from their god Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war. For nearly 200 years they wandered. Every time they tried to settle, the established city-states of the Valley of Mexico drove them away. They were seen as barbarians, uncivilized nomads with strange customs. They were the people at the bottom of the social hierarchy, sometimes even serving as mercenaries for more powerful groups. But in 1325, everything changed. On a swampy island in Lake Texcoco, the Mexica priests claimed they saw the prophesied sign, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. This, they declared, was where they would build their city. This image, by the way, still appears on the Mexican flag today, a powerful reminder of this moment. The location seemed terrible. It was a marshy island with limited farmland, surrounded by water, vulnerable to flooding. But this apparent weakness would become their greatest strength. The Mexica would turn this swamp into the Venice of the Americas, and they would do it through sheer ingenuity and relentless ambition. Here's where the story gets fascinating. The early Mexica didn't conquer their way to power. They outsmarted everyone. First, they solved the agricultural problem. They couldn't grow enough food on their small island, so they invented chinampas, artificial floating gardens. They drove stakes into the lakebed, wove them together with reeds, and piled on mud from the lake bottom. These gardens were incredibly fertile, producing multiple harvests per year. Some were 300 feet long and 30 feet wide. The Mexica transformed a limitation into an advantage, and soon they were producing more food than the cities on the mainland. But food wasn't enough. They needed political power, and they got it through marriages, alliances, and playing the existing powers against each other. In 1428, something crucial happened. The Mexica formed the Triple Alliance with 2 other city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan. Together, they defeated the tyrannical city-state of Azcapotzalco, which had been dominating the valley. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a psychological turning point. The Mexica went from refugees to kingmakers in just over a century, and under their 4th emperor, Itzcoatl, they did something shocking. They burned the old history books. Why would they do this? Because they wanted to rewrite their story. They created a new mythology that portrayed the Mexica as the chosen people, destined to rule. They claimed direct descent from the ancient Toltecs, the most prestigious civilization in Mexican memory. It was historical revisionism on a massive scale, and it worked. The Mexica began to believe their own propaganda, and more importantly, so did others. Under Emperors Moctezuma I and his successors, the Aztec Empire exploded across Mesoamerica. But this wasn't empire building as Europeans understood it. The Aztecs didn't occupy territory or impose direct rule. They created a tribute empire, a sophisticated system that was both brilliant and brutal. Here's how it worked. When the Aztecs conquered a city, they usually left the local rulers in place. They didn't station garrisons or administrators. Instead, they demanded tribute: jade, cacao, cotton, feathers, gold, and most controversially, people for sacrifice. The tribute lists that survived are staggering. One record shows 400 villages sending tribute to Tenochtitlan. We're talking about thousands of tons of goods flowing into the capital every year. The city of Tenochtitlan grew into a metropolis of somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Larger than London, larger than Paris. The Spanish who first saw it couldn't believe their eyes. One conquistador wrote that it seemed like an enchanted vision from the tale of Amadis. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether it was not all a dream. The city had everything: massive temples, palaces with rooms for thousands of people, a zoo with animals from across the empire, botanical gardens, a sophisticated aqueduct system bringing fresh water from the mainland, and a market in Tlatelolco where 60,000 people traded every day. You could buy anything there: chocolate from the south, obsidian from the north, parrots, jewelry, slaves, medicine, and thousands of other items. But beneath this prosperity ran a current of fear, because the Aztec system had a dark engine driving it forward. Let's talk about what everyone wants to know: human sacrifice. The numbers you've heard, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands per year, are they true? And why did the Aztecs do it? First, the facts. Yes, the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice on a scale unprecedented in the Americas. When the Great Temple was rededicated in 1487, Spanish sources claim 80,000 people were sacrificed over 4 days. Modern historians debate this number, some suggesting it was propaganda to justify Spanish conquest, others arguing the number might actually be accurate based on the logistics of the ceremony. But here's what most people don't understand. To the Aztecs, sacrifice wasn't evil. It was necessary. It was sacred. And to understand why, you need to understand their worldview. The Aztecs believed the universe had been created and destroyed 4 times before. They were living in the 5th sun, the 5th age of the world, and this world, like the others, would eventually end in catastrophic destruction unless the gods were fed. The sun needed strength to rise each day. The rains needed to come. The crops needed to grow. And all of this required payment in the most precious substance in the universe: human blood. This wasn't about cruelty. In their minds, it was about cosmic maintenance. The Aztecs saw themselves as partners with the gods in keeping reality itself from collapsing. Many of the sacrificial victims were prisoners of war, which is why the Aztecs engaged in flower wars, ritualized combat designed partly to capture enemies for sacrifice. But victims could also be slaves, tribute from conquered peoples, or even voluntary participants who saw sacrifice as a path to paradise. The ceremonies were elaborate and deeply religious. Victims were often treated with honor in their final days. Some were dressed as gods and paraded through the city. The method varied. Some had their hearts removed on top of pyramids, others were shot with arrows, some were burned, and some were ritually drowned. To modern eyes, it's horrifying. But we need to understand it in context, not to excuse it, but to truly comprehend what the Aztec world was like. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Every major civilization in history has done terrible things in the name of their beliefs. The Spanish who conquered the Aztecs burned people alive in the Inquisition. Medieval Europeans engaged in mass slaughter during the Crusades. The Romans fed people to lions for entertainment. The Aztecs weren't uniquely evil. They were products of their time and worldview, a worldview that seemed logical within their cosmological framework. But the tribute empire and the constant need for sacrificial victims created a fatal weakness. The Aztecs didn't inspire loyalty, they inspired resentment. By the early 1500s, the empire was massive but fragile. Conquered peoples paid tribute but weren't integrated into Aztec society. They had their own languages, their own gods, their own identities. They obeyed the Aztecs out of fear, not love, and many of them deeply hated Tenochtitlan. The Tlaxcalans, who had successfully resisted Aztec conquest for decades, absolutely despised them. The people of Totonac territories along the Gulf Coast chafed under tribute demands. Even cities that were technically allied with the Aztecs, like Texcoco, had their own ambitions and grievances. Emperor Moctezuma II, who took power in 1502, was a fascinating and tragic figure. He was deeply religious, a reformer who tried to centralize power and purify Aztec religion. He expanded the empire to its greatest extent, ruling over perhaps 5 million to 6 million people. But he also created problems. He instituted strict class divisions, limiting access to the nobility. He demanded more tribute, straining relationships with subject peoples. And he was, by all accounts, increasingly isolated in his palace, surrounded by luxury and religious ritual. Then came the omens, or at least that's what the sources tell us. Strange lights in the sky, a temple spontaneously bursting into flames, a comet appearing, a woman's voice crying out at night, prophesying doom. Modern historians debate whether these omens were real or invented after the fact to explain what happened next, but they became part of the story, the sense that something terrible was coming. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the Gulf Coast with about 600 men, 16 horses, and a handful of cannons. In any rational calculation, this tiny force stood no chance against an empire of millions. The Aztecs should have crushed them immediately. But they didn't, and to understand why, we need to understand both the brilliance of Cortés and the fatal miscalculations of Moctezuma. When Cortés arrived, he didn't just invade. He listened. He learned. The first thing he did was take on a translator, an indigenous woman known as La Malinche, who spoke both Nahuatl and Maya. Through her, Cortés discovered the secret that would destroy the Aztec Empire. Everyone hated the Aztecs. The Totonacs were the first to ally with him. They saw the Spanish as potential liberators, a way to throw off Aztec domination. Then the Tlaxcalans, after initially fighting the Spanish, made the same calculation. They had been resisting the Aztecs for decades. Now here was a powerful new ally, strange warriors with weapons of thunder and metal beasts that carried them into battle. Cortés promised these groups freedom from tribute. He promised them revenge, and they believed him. What he didn't tell them was that he planned to replace one empire with another. Meanwhile, in Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma was paralyzed by indecision. Some sources claim he thought Cortés might be the returning god Quetzalcoatl. This is probably exaggerated or invented by later writers, but it's true that Moctezuma seemed uncertain how to handle these strangers. He sent gifts, gold, elaborate feathered costumes, works of art. He probably meant these as diplomatic overtures, demonstrations of Aztec wealth and power that might convince the Spanish to leave. Instead, the gold inflamed Spanish greed. Cortés and his army, now swollen with thousands of indigenous allies, marched toward Tenochtitlan. And in November 1519, Moctezuma made a decision that still baffles historians. He let them in. What happened next was like a Greek tragedy, full of miscommunication, betrayal, and catastrophe. Cortés and his men were installed as guests in Tenochtitlan. They were housed in a palace, given food and gifts. The Aztecs still outnumbered them massively. The city had perhaps 200,000 people. Cortés had maybe 1,000 Spaniards and a few thousand indigenous allies. But the Spanish held one advantage. They had already demonstrated they were willing to kill without hesitation. Within days, Cortés made a shocking move. He took Moctezuma hostage in his own palace. The emperor, for reasons we still don't fully understand, went along with it. He continued to rule, but now under Spanish supervision, issuing orders that benefited the invaders. Perhaps he thought he could manage the situation diplomatically. Perhaps he was buying time. Perhaps he was genuinely paralyzed by the strangeness of the situation. For months, this bizarre arrangement held. Then Cortés had to leave the city to deal with a Spanish force sent to arrest him for unauthorized conquest. He left behind Pedro de Alvarado, a brutal man who lacked Cortés's political cunning. During a religious festival, Alvarado ordered his men to attack unarmed Aztec nobles performing a sacred dance. It was a massacre. Hundreds were killed in the temple courtyard. This was the breaking point. The city erupted in fury. The Spanish and their allies were besieged in their palace. Moctezuma tried to calm his people, but they rejected him. He was no longer their emperor, he was a collaborator. Stones rained down on him when he appeared, and days later he was dead. Whether from those wounds or killed by the Spanish, we'll never know with certainty. Cortés rushed back to find the city in full rebellion. On the night of June 30, 1520, the Noche Triste, the sad night, the Spanish tried to escape. It was a disaster. The Aztecs attacked from canoes in the darkness. Hundreds of Spaniards drowned in the lake, dragged down by the gold they'd looted. The causeway ran red with blood. Cortés supposedly sat beneath a tree and wept. But the Aztecs made a critical mistake. Instead of pursuing and destroying the fleeing Spanish completely, they focused on reclaiming their city and performing rituals for their dead. It gave Cortés time to retreat, regroup, and plan his return. When Cortés came back in 1521, he came with an army. Thousands of Tlaxcalans, Totonacs, and warriors from other cities joined him. Some estimates put his indigenous allies at over 100,000 fighters. This wasn't a Spanish conquest of the Aztecs. This was a coalition of indigenous peoples using Spanish weapons and tactics to destroy their oppressors. Cortés also brought something else: ships. He had dismantled ships on the coast, carried them overland, and rebuilt them as brigantines on Lake Texcoco. Now he controlled the water, cutting off the city's supply lines. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted 93 days. It was brutal beyond imagination. The Aztecs, now led by the young Emperor Cuauhtémoc, fought with desperate courage. They tore up the causeways. They rained arrows and spears from the rooftops. They fought for every street, every temple, every house. But they were doomed, not just by Spanish steel and indigenous allies, but by an invisible enemy: smallpox. The disease had arrived with the Spanish, and the Aztecs had no immunity. It ravaged the city during the siege, killing thousands. The emperor who replaced Moctezuma, Cuauhtémoc, died of it after ruling for just 80 days. Bodies piled in the streets. The social order collapsed, and still the Aztecs fought. By August 1521, Tenochtitlan was in ruins. 3/4 of the city had been destroyed in the fighting. The canals were choked with corpses. Survivors were starving. Finally, on August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured trying to escape by canoe. The Aztec Empire, which had ruled for nearly a century, was finished. What came next was, in many ways, worse than the conquest itself. The Spanish systematically destroyed Aztec culture. They tore down the temples and built churches on the ruins. They burned most of the codices, the painted books that contained Aztec history, science, and religion. They outlawed the old ceremonies and forced conversions to Christianity. The tribute empire was replaced by Spanish colonial rule, often using the exact same tribute systems but now serving Spanish masters. The population collapse was catastrophic. Disease, war, forced labor, and disruption of agriculture killed millions. Some estimates suggest the indigenous population of central Mexico fell from around 25 million before contact to just 1 million by 1605. It was a demographic catastrophe on a scale almost unimaginable. But here's what the simple conquest story misses. Aztec culture didn't completely die. It transformed. It mixed with Spanish culture to create something new. The Day of the Dead, one of Mexico's most famous traditions, blends indigenous beliefs about death and ancestors with Catholic All Saints' Day. The language Nahuatl is still spoken by over 1 million people. Foods that fed the Aztecs, corn, beans, chocolate, tomatoes, chili peppers, spread around the world and transformed global cuisine. And perhaps most importantly, the Aztecs themselves, or rather their descendants, the Mexica and other Nahuatl-speaking peoples, didn't disappear. Their genes and culture flowed into the mestizo population that would eventually become modern Mexico. The eagle devouring the serpent, the symbol that marked the founding of Tenochtitlan, still flies on Mexico's flag. So what's the shocking truth about the Aztec Empire? It's that almost everything in the popular story is too simple. The Aztecs weren't uniquely bloodthirsty savages who deserved conquest. They were a sophisticated civilization with remarkable achievements in agriculture, engineering, art, astronomy, and mathematics. They built one of the world's great cities and created a complex political system that controlled millions of people. But they also weren't innocent victims of unprovoked European aggression. They built their empire on conquest and tribute. They terrorized their neighbors. They practiced human sacrifice on a massive scale. These things are historical facts, uncomfortable as they may be. The Spanish conquest wasn't a simple story of superior Europeans defeating primitive natives. It was a complex civil war where indigenous peoples made calculated decisions to ally with foreign invaders against an empire they hated. The Tlaxcalans and others weren't naive or tricked. They were making strategic choices based on their own interests. And the fall of the Aztecs wasn't inevitable. Cortés got incredibly lucky multiple times. If the Totonacs had killed his small force when they first landed, if Moctezuma had ordered an immediate attack, if the Aztecs had pursued the Spanish after the Noche Triste and destroyed them completely, if smallpox hadn't arrived when it did, history might have been completely different. The truth is messy and complicated. The Aztecs were neither noble savages living in harmony with nature nor bloodthirsty demons deserving destruction. They were human beings who built something extraordinary, made terrible choices based on their worldview, and fell to a combination of disease, internal division, and their own imperial policies coming back to haunt them. Today, Mexico City sits on top of Tenochtitlan. The modern city's subway system occasionally breaks through into ancient Aztec structures. The Templo Mayor, the great temple that Cortés saw, has been partially excavated in the heart of the city. You can visit it, walk among stones that Moctezuma walked on, see the skull racks where sacrificial victims' heads were displayed. The Aztec Empire lasted less than a century in its full form, a blink of an eye in historical terms. But its impact echoes through the centuries. It reminds us that empires, no matter how powerful they seem, are fragile things. That the very systems that bring success can become fatal weaknesses. That history is never as simple as conquerors and conquered, good guys and bad guys. The Aztecs rose from nothing to rule millions. They built wonders that amazed even their enemies. They developed a worldview that made them see cosmic necessity in acts we find horrifying. And they fell not just to foreign conquest, but to the resentment of those they had conquered, to disease they couldn't fight, and to leaders who couldn't adapt fast enough to a changing world. Their story is a human story, full of ambition, achievement, cruelty, courage, and tragedy. And that's the real shocking truth. That even 500 years later, we can see ourselves in their triumphs and their failures. If you found this journey through history fascinating and want to explore more stories from the neural battlefields of human civilization, where ideas, empires, and cultures clashed and transformed each other, make sure to subscribe to Neural Battlefields. Hit that like button if this changed how you think about the Aztec Empire, and share this with anyone who loves history that goes deeper than the surface. There are so many more stories to uncover, so many more truths hiding beneath the myths. I'll see you in the next one.